All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back, episode 54, or episode number 3 of season 3. We're here with Shain Stephens. We are chatting Australia Day. Sorry, it's late.
It's hard to put a...
Even on stage, like my knees
Frame you up.
the training. In the rush of things, you can still stay controlled. Fitness.
So, ladies and gentlemen, episode number 3 of season number 3, or episode 54 in total. We're here with Shain Stephens, one of the fittest dads from the Perth fitness scene, F45 extraordinaire, and the owner of F45 Vic Park and East Perth. Shain, welcome on.
Welcome. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for being on. So this is a really important one. It's one which I've wanted to do for a few years. We were looking at doing it and releasing it for Australia Day, but just with family and work commitments, it's been pushed back. But the purpose of us catching up was because you and I had a discussion a few months ago around Australia Day. So I found out that you were of Aboriginal descent back then, and I got to ask you a whole bunch of questions that I've always wanted to know. I guess we're in a situation now. I'm what you would call a European Australian. I grew up in a European Australian family, and with the things like Invasion Day, Triple J, moving the hottest 100 across the day, for me that was very, very hard to understand, because my lens or background was, well, I'm Australian, I'm proud, this is like our day of celebration. But that's because I grew up with that lens from a European Australian family. So I thought, hey, maybe there's something you don't understand about this situation, and it would be great to sit down with someone who is Aboriginal and find out more. When we chatted, I was like, perfect, I found my guy. So first of all, let's kick things off. So whereabouts did you grow up? What was the community like? And what's the process of growing up as an Aboriginal kid?
Look, I think it's like anybody, you know, when you're growing up, you've got your mum, your dad, your family, but with us, the family is a lot bigger. Like, instead of just having a few people, you got hundreds of people. So, you know, you don't have friends, you just have cousins. So growing up, you just have family. Everywhere you go, everyone's your cousin. I was born in Darwin, and I grew up there with this huge extended family with a very strong Aboriginal identity. And even though we weren't living on our country was not too far away. I'm an Iwaidja man, and that's my mum's country, which is out in Arnhem Land near Croker Island there. And that's where we would go back to homeland.
Can you explain that? So when you say not within your own country, does that mean not on the mainland of Australia?
No, not within our tribal lands, where we are custodians of.
Okay.
So you'll find there are a lot of Aboriginal people who don't live on their country. There's a whole series of displacements that have happened over time as Aboriginal people have been moved over the last 200 years off their country into other places. And then you've got the usual process of migration to where work and life and things happen. And our family all settled in Darwin, which was very close to where we originally came from. But that's where the family grew up.
Okay, cool. Your mum or your family or your parents, did they grow up in Darwin, or did they grow up within their country?
Mum grew up in Darwin.
Okay, gotcha.
My grandmother was one of the last groups who grew up in her country for our family. One of the last custodians of our language and all of our cultural knowledge for our family. But as I said, through displacement, stolen generation, lots of things, you'll find lots of stories within Aboriginal families where people are no longer rooted in their country. They've been moved off it, and they had to make lives with their family in new places.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so going back, like for me saying I'm, that white European Australian, my ancestors were part of the convicts that came over. So I like to say, back when our ancestors came through, you had to be a criminal to get into the country.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, essentially. So I didn't understand that there were obviously different Aboriginal tribes. That's something that we understand, but actual like different key groups or these countries. So can you explain that a little bit more, all these different tribes and how they lived?
Look, I think the key here to remember is before European settlement, Australia still had its own natural boundaries where Aboriginal tribes would move in and around their own custodial areas. But there weren't just 6 or 7 of them. There were literally hundreds of them. And within these hundreds of countries, there were also diverse language, diverse cultural practices, diverse song lines and movement patterns that allowed these people to move with the seasons, that allowed our ancestors to stay connected to their country and to sustain life as they needed. From the people who lived on the coastal country, saltwater people, right into the desert and those people, we all had very unique languages, stories, songs, and cultural habits.
Now, you growing up as an Aboriginal kid going through the school system, being in Darwin, what was your experience like? Did you have limitations growing up? One thing that we did want to point out as well is that being in Darwin and where you were from, your group or tribe, sorry, I'm using the wrong word.
Look, I think Indigenous people, we're not just one tribe in Darwin. There's lots of different outlying cultural groups, Aboriginal groups that sit in and around the town of Darwin. Okay,
Yep.
Larrakia Nation, that's their country on top of Darwin.
Yes.
And they are the custodians of that land. And then from out around all of that coastal area, right out to the Tiwi Islands and further, a lot of us have all moved into that town, and we live and work and have our lives in there.
And you said that was about 30%.
Yeah, I think we're somewhere around 25-30% of the population of Darwin is Indigenous and has Indigenous bloodlines in it. So we make up a significant part of that town and the culture of that town, and how we play a big role in all areas of art, music, commerce, politics, sports. Yeah.
So what was then your experience growing up? And that was my key point with this, is that before we came on, we discussed that you would have had a different experience to Aboriginals that live in other cities or towns.
Yeah, I certainly think having a town that had a strong Indigenous Aboriginal identity meant that you were able to grow up with a lot of confidence about who you were and where you fit within that community. Growing up in Darwin, my Aboriginality was never questioned.
Yeah.
Because I'm very fair and I look very European. I admit that. Most people look at me and think I'm Greek or Italian.
Yeah. We've had, that's what we had. I was like Greek, Italian, Spanish.
But it's one of those things where, because everyone knew who my mum was, who my grandmother was, who my great-grandfather was, and who all of my uncles and aunties were, there's never a question of who you are or where you fit. But I think when you're from a much smaller percentage of population in some of the bigger cities and some of the more displaced Aboriginal populations, you would have had a very different upbringing and experience of life to what I did. Mm-hmm. Whether it be through opportunity and advantage or through disadvantage and oppression, there would have been very different experiences across the nation. But I think the experience is what's allowed me to be who I am today, if that makes any sense. It allows me to play a role that I can in the community that I can today.
Awesome. Now, one thing that we spoke about off camera as well is I said, I asked if you were half Aboriginal, to which you said, because I said, your mum and your dad, I was asking the background, I said, are you half Aboriginal? He said, well, no, I'm Aboriginal because there's no halves. You're either Aboriginal or you're not. Whereas Shell, so my wife, she's half Malaysian, like her mum's Malaysian and her dad's Australian. And so we said we're going to have equations. Yeah. I guess explain that to me a little bit more.
Well, look, a little bit of a history lesson. Firstly, there was what's called a casting system that was used a long, long time ago. And it was to sort of help segregate out the more European-looking Indigenous people and put them into systems that separated them from families and allowed them to become assimilated into mainstream society. So the lighter you got, the more distant you got from your Aboriginal appearance, the casting system allowed them to segregate out. And that was the whole thing around the stolen generation. Okay. And the whiter you were, the higher risk you were of being taken away, not to mention all the other horrible things that happened around that. But that was part of it, was this casting system of half caste, quarter caste, octoon, all that sort of stuff. And so we don't identify like that. And a real simple way to explain it for most people is if you have a cup of tea and you put milk in it, does it now become half tea?
Yeah.
It's still tea. No matter how much milk you put in it until it's almost white and milky, it's still tea. It's just a different shade of tea.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a real simple way, I think, of looking at it. We're
It's a good
always
analogy.
Aboriginal.
Yeah.
And we hold that really deeply inside us. It's not to do with the colour of our skin or the shape of our nose or whether we speak with a Aboriginal accent and slang and sound like we're from the bush. We are Aboriginal in our essence and in our hearts.
Now, I'm going to move to a different question because this kind of fits in a little bit better here, and talking about bloodlines and oppression being carried down.
Yeah.
So I had a discussion. We have a very, very close friend, so close that we have matching tattoos. And she has Aboriginal children. Mm-hmm. And so we got to learn a little bit more, and they spoke about things like the oppression being passed down through generations through a bloodline. Is that like a true thing? And you talk about holding your Aboriginal culture close, and how would something like that affect you?
Yeah, look, for me, because of where I came from, there are certainly stories that get passed on. And there's certainly feelings and emotions that get passed down from your great-grandparents to your grandparents to your parents and then onto you and onto your children. And stories of fear of authorities, having to run away so that your children are not taken from you. You hold on to that emotion. And it's something that I think anybody who's been through any sort of oppression or suffering at the hands of another human, you hold on to that. And because we have such a strong oral culture where we pass on those stories, we also pass on the emotion and the stress. And I do think we're getting, as a community, better at sharing it in the appropriate ways. But there's always going to be that lingering effect of a little bit of fear of authorities and what happens when you're involved with the authorities, whether it be police or whatever. Okay.
Now, specifically going back to Australia Day, which is what we wanted to talk about when we were looking at releasing this originally. Now, from my small amount of research going into this, and again, being a European Australian where all I've known is Australia Day. I grew up in Canberra, so I'm pretty sure Canberra would have been one of the first places to adopt Australia Day first. And so the things I didn't know. So Australia Day was originally called Anniversary Day or Foundation Day. It wasn't until 1946 that it was actually called Australia Day. And at that stage, it was the closest Monday to the 26th to ensure that we could have a long weekend every single year.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And then it wasn't until 1946. It wasn't until 1994 that Australia Day became officially the national day to be celebrated on the 26th. So I didn't know that because, like I said, I grew up in Canberra. I'm pretty sure it's always been on the 26th since I was growing up. Now, things like Triple J and the Hottest 100 and the big push about Invasion Day and about Aboriginal culture and moving things to another day outside of the 26th. So when this first started getting published a lot, for me, because I didn't grow up, I didn't grow up during when all these things were happening, and I don't feel that, I held on to racism or I wasn't a part of it. And I'm like, well, hold on, that's Australia back then. We're part of Australia now. Aren't we one, aren't we like, one country together and everyone has this equal opportunity? If this is a day which is celebrated in Australia, then isn't it offensive to not have it on this day? And what I realized is I don't understand Aboriginal culture, is that there's probably a lot of things I didn't know, and it would be best to ask questions. So first of all, with Invasion Day, what is that? What was Australia Day to you growing up?
It's just another day. Really simply, I think the thing to understand around Australia is that within our nation, and I am sort of stealing this from a couple of other Indigenous leaders that I've been listening to over the last few weeks, because there's been a lot of media and publicity and stuff around this. And I really do feel this in my heart as well, that within Australia we have three different narratives running alongside each other. You've got the First Nations people who have been here for hundreds of thousands of years practicing our culture here. And we have one story that is being told that we don't want forgotten. Mm-hmm. And then coming into that 230 something years ago, you've got this other story that begins with settlement. Now, at some point that settlement was going to happen, whether it was the Dutch, the French, the English, but it happened to be the English. And now, while there is oppression and there is lots of things that negatively have happened to Indigenous people, at some point it was going to happen that we were going to be colonised.
Mm-hmm.
But then alongside that other story, we are the most diverse immigrant nation in the world because of how our nation has been built on the back of immigrants. You and your wife are a great example of this, okay? And you've got all three narratives being told. Now, we really respect the narrative of the immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we sort of want people to become Australian citizens on Australian Day, to become a part of Australia on that most Australian day. We really respect the story and history of our colonists, because that's what the education is taught in schools. This is the history of white Australia and its development as a nation.
You get taught Australia's 200 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's when Aboriginal people get forgotten.
Yep.
All those years of history is gone. And it's kind of like, well, history only started 230 something years ago. And what we're saying is, no, it didn't. It started a long time before that, and we want it recognised. And Australia Day is quite a contentious point, because that was kind of, for a lot of us, the beginning of the end of a lot of Indigenous history.
Mm-hmm.
And when my grandmother passed away, she died with her language. Sorry, I get emotional. She's the last person who could speak our language. And that wouldn't have happened if we were strong in our culture. But that gets diluted when you look at colonisation. So for a lot of us, that's a strong thing that we want the date shifted to become more inclusive and to recognise all three of those narratives, especially all of our 60,000 years of history.
Is there any way that I guess Aboriginal culture is celebrated at the moment? Is there a specific event or a day which is a mainstream thing that everyone knows about? It's something that I don't know about.
Look, I don't think we have any individual or specific days that we celebrate ourselves to go, this is Aboriginal Day.
Yes.
Or this is, like in the US, you've got Black History Month or any of those sort of things. Like there's not an individual day that we celebrate, because I think when it's your culture and your history, it's something that you live through every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what really gets a lot of the Indigenous Australians quite riled up, is that the non-Indigenous Australia is really hanging on to this one day like it is the be-all and end-all to celebrate Australia. But what they're really forgetting in the process is that it's diminishing the impact that Indigenous Australians have had on this country as well.
So going through school, I don't think that we ever really got Aboriginal culture like studies.
Yeah.
Not from what I can remember. At least nothing which I have taken away and that I live with, or that I remember being taught. You got two young boys that are they're both in school at the moment. Yeah,
yes.
they play sport. Yeah, of course they're in school.
They're both in school.
Yeah, they're little basketball athletes. Do they get taught Aboriginal culture outside of at home? Is it something which is taught in school? Is it like an elective? Is it part of history?
Look, we have NAIDOC Week,
okay,
which is a pretty big week and celebration of, I guess, everything Indigenous. So just to correct myself from what I said before, we do have NAIDOC Week and we have NAIDOC Day, and there's a series of marches and events that happen around that to try and celebrate everything Indigenous Australia. And even though we have this, and even though schools, I think, try and implement, it's still, when you look at some of the content, it's still not reflective of the history, but still very stereotypical Aboriginal. So we're going to do a dot painting, and we're going to make a boomerang, and we're going to look at some pictures of Aboriginal people, which is usually a black man in a loincloth holding a spear, which is not representative of Aboriginal Australia as we stand now.
Okay.
We are a very diverse culture, and there's a lot of catching up to do within the education system. But we discussed this before earlier on. I think if people really want to know about Aboriginal culture within their community, you've just got to go and talk to people. Mm. We are great storytellers. We love telling a story and having a good yarn and talking about our opinions, our ideas, and how we feel about our community. I think that's probably the beginning point there.
And I do take it back. We did the Sorry Day when Kevin Rudd was in. I was in school when that was on, and I just got prompted. when you said dot paintings. So we had little hands, so we had to do dot paintings
Dot
on
paintings.
them. Yeah, and we all got to put it down. But we didn't
Yeah.
understand, like, again, European, Australian,
Yeah.
what are we saying sorry for? We weren't a part of this. That's the lens that I was brought up with.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this conversation is important for me. And I'm sure that, 50%, 80% of people that watch this probably have the same experience growing up.
Yeah, I think most Australians do, because it's the way that history books are written is the way that it's then taught in schools, and it's the knowledge then that people carry with them through life is what we are taught in those early years. So, yeah.
So then what would be your thoughts or your ideas? And again, to elaborate, this is from your perspective. And we said that different Aboriginal cultures from Australia would have a different background and a different lens that they look through. How do you think, or first of all, would it be appropriate to move Australia Day? Number one. Number two, how would be a better way to celebrate Australia as an all-inclusive celebration?
Look, I think right now, to just suddenly up and move a date and then just go and have the same celebration on another date, I think would be a little bit tokenistic, in my opinion. I don't think
agree.
necessarily just moving the date is what it's about. It's about having the conversation, having two-way understandings and developing new knowledges and understandings about what these dates mean and how they can become more inclusive for everybody. Not just Indigenous Australians or the immigrant Australians or the European Australians, but for everybody to be a part of that conversation on what we want our nation to be recognised for, how we want it to be looked at. And part of that is how we celebrate our nation, how we celebrate its creation and how we celebrate it moving forward, for all generations to be included in it. It's about the conversation.
Now, talking about oppression, and we spoke about bloodlines before, but what are some of the current disadvantages that Aboriginal people face, which maybe progress them from being able to move forward, not get opportunities that, white people face? And again, I always revert back to my lens. I was like, hey, it's like, well, this is my thoughts a while ago. So let's say it's 2015. Doesn't everyone get equal opportunities now? Isn't racism bad? Again, white person mentality, because that's just what I assumed.
Look, I think on the racism point, I think we all like to think that we are not racist. Even Aboriginal people like to think they're not racist. But given the right setting, a little bit of it will always come out. And the best example is the barbecue moments that I have, because I'm very European looking. And you're talking with people and they drop the bung word in conversation. And suddenly then I'll pull them up and go, look, that's not appropriate. And they kind of take a step back and they're like, ooh, I've offended somebody. And then I explain why. And then it creates this awkward moment where people don't know what to say after that moment. And I think we all need to understand that racism is there at all times, but we need to be vigilant on it to stamp it out, which means if you are with your friends and family at a barbecue moment and someone drops a bung, a nigger or whatever, and it is an offensive use of the term, then we need to pull them up and stop that. That's point one on some of it. I think in terms of disadvantage that Aboriginal people face, and this is a huge question, because there's so much that depending on where you grow up, I think everybody can face disadvantages. But when you're Aboriginal, there's an expectation almost that you are already going to fail, I think, when we go into seek out a job or start education or whatever. And unless we're going in and as an athlete, quite often it's just assumed that we're not going to be as smart, as effective, as diligent. We're not going to work hard. There's all of these assumed behaviours about Aboriginal people which make it hard for us to succeed. So you do have to, at times, feel like you've got to work twice as hard to prove people wrong. But education is always going to be an issue. Accessibility to education and services, because there's a lot of Aboriginal people that still live remote or on the fringes of communities. They don't have that same access. Employment is always going to be a challenge. I think we've got a long road to beat out, and we've only been a part of the European system and way of thinking and doing things for 230 years, which is not a lot of generations to suddenly catch up to centuries of operating in those systems. And, so we're playing a lot of catch up.
That's a really valid point. And again, this is something that we spoke about briefly off camera. So, colonization, is that right? It was 230
something years ago.
Yeah, so let's say
Give or take.
230 years ago, and Aboriginal communities have had to adapt very, very fast, and to be able to adapt's not the right word. Have been able to integrate.
Adapt and integrate is exactly right.
Yeah, into I guess we'll say Western culture and the way of doing things. For me, that's not something that I'd ever thought about before. But when you compared it, you said if you look at Chinese culture, this is 5 generations.
230 is probably about 5 or 6 generations.
5 or 6 generations to adapt.
Yeah.
You talked about bloodline. You talk about things being passed down, emotions being passed down. Whereas if we look at a Chinese culture, it's like tens of thousands of generations.
Yeah, being involved in mathematics and commerce and trade, and not leading a life that flowed with the seasons and the country, but you set up a town, you build a town, and you make the seasons follow what you want to do because you start farming. And while there are examples of Aboriginal people having those practices as well, they were on a much smaller scale. And I think if you look at the first 100 years of settlement being lots of genocide and removal of country and clearing of lands and being moved off your lands, and then the next 100 years of being forced to try and get people to assimilate into things, Aboriginal people have really only had maybe the last sort of 60 to 70 years of really becoming a part of society, a part of commerce, a part of the education system in a successful way, where we are not just the lackey and the slave, or the working hand. We are the people now leading some of those processes, and it hasn't been a long journey for us when you look at that.
Yes.
By comparison to other cultures who have had it within them for thousands of years, those things have been ingrained in generation after generation after generation.
Yeah, and when we're talking 60 years, we're literally talking 2 to 3 generations.
Yes.
Yeah, so big difference. If we look at Australia in parallel to America, and they talk about like the divisions between black, white, Native Indians, Native Americans, and from what we see from the media, and I say from what we see because obviously we're in Australia and we get fed it, and it looks like it is a very segregated country at the moment. Do you think that Australia is somewhat similar, or do you think that we are much more inclusive? Do you think that we're going in the right direction?
I can't speak on behalf of what happens in the US, but certainly there are similarities. I think any time you've got a nation of people that have been colonized, there's going to be parallels to things that happen within those Indigenous populations, and then with the immigrant populations that get brought in. And I think the US has an extra diversity to it with the slave population that was brought in, which creates a whole new dynamic for that country. Look, I think within Australia right now, we are having a lot of the right conversations. And there's a lot of people who are wanting to have the conversations. And I think because of it, platforms like Triple J and, other media picking up a lot of these conversations, it's becoming more mainstream. And I think last year's Hottest 100 actually had a Change the Date song was in the Hottest 100. Okay, so I think it's becoming a little bit more acceptable to just talk about it.
Well, this year they did change the date.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of stuff happening there that is showing that mainstream Australia, as a larger population, is starting to think about it. And that's the beginning point, because once we start thinking about it, we want to talk about it. And once we start talking about it, we can then start taking action on the conversations that are had.
And even looking, I guess, from my personal experience, and initially going, well, why would we change it? And the things I've explained before, well, I'm Australian, and, can't I be proud of being Australian? Not thinking about, the reasoning behind all of this. But for the media to talk about it, for these things start to take place, and then for me as a European Australian to go, hey, maybe there's something that I don't know, and then us to have a conversation about it. So that's a real life personal example as well.
And I really do think, I don't think Australians need to stop being proud of their nation. I don't think that's what it's about. And they don't need to be proud of the day that their nation became a nation. But they also then, I think, need to have a little reflection on what happened beyond that point.
Yes.
And that's what it's about.
Yeah.
Being inclusive and recognizing that not everything was all fairy floss and candy and this is a great place, but there was also blood, sweat, tears, loss of life, and oppressions that happened in that process.
Now, recently we had the Australian bushfires. as well, which was quite large. My parents were affected by that, and I saw conversations through the media talking about how now the government will be seeking advice or counsel from Aboriginal cultures about how to proper handle the country within situations like this. So how to do safe back burning and understanding the land better. Do you think that there's a lot that the current government and current Australians can learn about, about Australia as a country, as a land?
Yeah. Like I said, it's only been 200, and we keep going back to that number, 230, but it's not a lot of generations, which is why those stories, those songlines, those connection to country, those cultures and habits around how we manage our country. And we have always been custodians and caretakers of that country. Just because we were displaced or removed from it didn't mean the knowledge was lost. Okay, and there's a real big drive within Aboriginal communities now to reconnect with that process and redevelop those knowledges and skills. And I certainly think that Aboriginal people have a lot to offer. You just got to ask. Okay, in a lot of cases, they're not going to come forward and just write you a thesis on what you should do, but they will have a conversation with you about it. And they will certainly give you the education and knowledge they have from all of their experience, not just theirs, but all those generations before them, where that story was passed down from generation to generation.
Comparing this to a current day situation, which is within the wellness space, which is, I guess, on the cusp of the fitness space. There's some people that are into fitness, that are into bodyweight movement, that are into the wellness side of things as well. And we see a lot of things like, earthing, a lot of things like breath work, a lot of more spiritual, I guess, holistic things. Now, these have come from all different countries and practices and teachers. Is there Aboriginal cultures or Aboriginal teachers that teach not these sort of things specific, but the more spiritual side of things, where white people or European Australians can go and learn more about getting in contact with the earth?
All across Australia, even here in Perth, there are elders and Indigenous leaders who will gladly take you on a walking tour through areas of Perth and tell you the history and the culture and help you become connected and more spiritually aware of the country you are in. It is part of our oral history. It's part of how we share our history and culture is through storytelling. And there are loads of places. You've just got to hit up Google and you'll find a tour operator who will charge you a fee, of course, and then take you on a real educational journey through your own town, your own place, and teach you a whole new story about that place.
That's cool. And so I'm gonna look into that. So I'll post about this later, and I'll go through an experience myself, learn, and I'll do a write up for people, and I'll post where they can find out more information too. Now, white Australians, European Australians, immigrants, people that want to learn more. What's your advice outside of, you've said just reach out? What's your advice to go and learn more? You told me about TV channels before.
Look, we've got NITV is a great place to go and get exposed to Aboriginal comedy, Aboriginal stories, Torres Strait Islander language, dancing, everything you can encompass within a singular nation, even though we are multiple nations that make up this Indigenous population. NITV is a great entry level. Mm-hmm. It's from the safety of your own home in your lounge chair, so you don't feel like you're offending anybody in the process, but there's a lot of learning that can happen there. And you get to see what is important to Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal Australians through their media, told through their voices and their people, which is really cool. But then I think, the other part is just reach out.
Yep.
There's lots of Indigenous organisations within the community. Next time there's a NAIDOC Day celebration, go and be a part of it. Just go and sit in as an active listener and participant. You'll be amazed at what you get to see. And I know people won't love all of it. Some of it will be confronting, but that's part of the learning process.
Cool. I love it. NAIDOC, I'm going to look into this. I'm going to look into some TV channels, and I'm going to go get a tour. Shain Stephens, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on board.
It's hard to put
even on stage, like my knees
frame you up.
the training. In the rush of things, you can still stay controlled.
Fitness.